This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome to the podcast, everyone. I'm Randy Moore. I'm the Randy of the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. And as always, I'm joined by Pastor Andy Payton. Andy is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. We say that even though we realize that most of our audience is probably familiar with the Methodist Temple, probably because they attend here, they're members here. But because we're on the World Wide Web, I mean, it's wide open, right? So for those of you who have found us and don't know where we are, that's why I mentioned that. But Andy's the lead pastor here. We're on Lincoln Avenue, real close to the University of Evansville, and I am the associate pastor. And this is our episode 50. Wow.
I can't believe it. We made it to 50, Randy.
Yeah, it is. It is. And so, 100 will come even faster.
Right.
It'll seem that way anyway.
Exciting.
No, that's good. And I'm happy about it. I know you are too. And we have a dream next year of adding video to this. And that will allow us not only to, have pictures, but to have guests. I mean, we've had guests now, but we can bring guests in by Zoom or by any other service like that. And just like the World Wide Web opens up our audience in an potentially unlimited way, that will open up our guests. And I know that you and I have people that we would love to be able to get on the podcast who are not necessarily local. Not that there aren't wonderful people locally that we could bring in.
It's going to be exciting. I mean, I used the word exciting to talk about the fact we have 50 episodes, but then it's exciting to think about the possibilities, like you said, of folks that we can bring in to talk about whatever's going on in the world and do these deep dives on some of these conversations that we are having. And yeah.
And we're only in competition with about 5 million other podcasts, but it's it's the future. It's the fragmentation of the audience, right? I mean, it's just sliced into tiny little pieces of the pie. Mm-hmm. Back when I started in my television career, there were only 3 television stations, and you just dominated. If you were going to watch television, you only had 3 choices, not unlimited choices. But it's exciting. We appreciate our audience, and that's you out there, and we really do thank you for listening. Okay, we're continuing then with our sermon series on the stained glass windows at Methodist Temple. If you've ever been here, you've seen them, of course. And on the east wall are the Beatitudes, the 8 from the Sermon on the Mount, and then 2 more from Gospels outside of Matthew. And then if you cross the sanctuary to the other side, to the west wall, we have some of the parables of Jesus. And last Sunday, Pastor Andy preached on the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. But before we get into that, we always like to do a soul check-in. And if you've been with us, you've heard this explain this before, but for those who might not be familiar, a lot of people tend to think that soul and body are somehow separate. That's more of a Greco-Roman idea, which got picked up by early Christianity because they were heavily influenced by it. But the Jewish way of thinking about the soul would be, which carries over, of course, into Christianity, is that it's not a separation, it's just part of the whole. Mm-hmm. Part of our being. So we'd like to check in, and we check in because John Wesley checked in with his pastors in the early days of the Methodist movement to see whether their souls were prospering. That kind of tells me that some souls were not prospering.
Yeah, oh, definitely.
if a check-in was required.
Yeah, I've been talking about this for the last couple of weeks, but I have been reading about the early Methodist groups, and it's kind of a funny story how they actually got started in terms of the pragmatics of it all. The Wesleys had built a preaching house, I think it was in Bristol, and then they realized, we have to pay for this, so what are we going to do? Well, they got to talking back and forth, and they said, we're going to do a capital campaign, and we're going to send people out just to go out and collect so much money every week, and we'll pay for the building. Well, in doing that, they came to realize that folks weren't doing all that great living out the Methodist general rules, and so they decided we should probably create some small groups to hold one another accountable to who we said we're going to be. And that's how it really got started in terms of early on. I mean, Wesley did that with some of his friends at Oxford, yes, But when it came to like, we're going to do this and it's going to apply to the Methodist, they called them societies, which is what we would call a congregation, really. The Methodist societies then begin to be broken into what they called classes, which is these small groups where they would ask the question, how is it with your soul? Does it prosper?
Wow. I've taken all that Methodist history, but I had in my mind that it was the
Me too.
small groups,
Me too.
then the buildings. That's what seems to make sense, but that's really good. And that's an early warning about, as wonderful as our buildings are, it's not really about the buildings, and to the degree that we can get back to the groups, to the societies, to the classes, to that intimacy that's shared in a smaller group, to that extent is to the extent that we'll succeed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Another Methodist pastor by the name of George Whitefield, it's been said he is the better of the preachers. So, think about that. He's a better preacher than John Wesley or Charles Wesley. At the end of Whitefield's career, he said, where did all the converts go? Because he did not do the small group thing. And then, of course, Wesley, at the end of his career, Methodism was taking off like wildfire because they were intentionally coming together and thinking about, how is my life with God? Not some sort of content debate about some idea about God, no. But how is it with your soul? How is it with your experience with God? And then let's reflect. Mm-hmm. It's powerful.
So let's reflect. I told you just before we started today that, and of course you were aware of what was going on because I was communicating yesterday, but my wife Lisa's mother's husband had passed last night. And you and I have talked about this before. As pastors, we spend more time with sick and dying people than most people, if you're not a doctor or a nurse,
mm-hmm.
you don't work in a hospital. And so not only was I able to be there yesterday, I was actually on my way to work at the television station when Lisa gave me a call, my wife, and said, Jim's not doing well, and if you want to come, that would be the time to come. So I turned around. And so not only was I there as a member of the family, I was there in my role as a pastor. Jim was not a church person, and I'm the closest thing that he had, to a pastor, and he was very, very curious. He was an interesting man, interested in everything, and he was interested in my life in the church, in my life as a pastor, and he was very interested. And he grew up in the United Methodist Church here in Evansville. I would try to name the church they were affiliated with, but I'd probably get it wrong, and it doesn't really matter. But as an adult, he never continued with that. But he was interested, and he was interested in the schism that was going on, still is, I guess, going on in the church over human sexuality. And so we had some really, really, good conversations. And so, to be with him and to be with his family in his last moments, I was happy to be able to do that. And so, as odd as it might sound, that is soul nourishing.
Yeah,
in its own way.
I'm not sure I have the words to convey it,
right.
But I understand what you're saying because I've been there too.
Yeah,
they're holy. It's a holy, holy moment.
Yeah, I said, because we have 7 grandchildren, as I prayed, I said, we've been celebrating the entry into the world, and now we need to acknowledge someone's exit, from this world. They're both sacred moments, and we are reminded by this one that path in, which we've already taken, and that path out is a path that we're all going to take out. And so it should cause us to reflect on the fact that each year is a gift, each day is a gift, each moment is a gift. So,
wow. Well, certainly I'll be praying for Lisa and her family, and you're such a great presence in those scenarios too, Randy. I'm glad you were able to be there. You really are.
Well, thank you.
That's a gift that you have. So, yeah. Well, this past weekend was the anniversary of my dad's death. Mm. He died a year ago, July the 21st. It fell on a Sunday. And so this Sunday that I preached was my anniversary of my dad's death. And it's one of those moments where you'll never forget where you were. You'll never forget what was happening. And so, I don't know. I'm sad. I grieve. I'm grateful that I was able to be there. Yeah. my soul, how does my soul feel? I don't know if I have the words for it, but I know God's with me. I can tell you that much. There were signs of God's presence through that process of my dad's death, and then since then, absolutely. God gives us just enough to know, really, that we're not alone if you're paying attention. I read something about miracles the other day. The person said, God will give us just enough miracle to know that we're not alone, but not too much. Not too much miracle, so as to keep us from, our own agency and our own responsibility in it. So God didn't make us to be, sit back and wait kind of folks. We're supposed to get up and get going. Jesus said to come follow him. And so, yeah, there's been just enough miracle along that process. So that's where my soul's at in a lot of ways, Randy.
Well, I didn't do this intentionally, but we're talking about death here during our soul check-in. And our parable today has to do with two people who had recently died. And so it's the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Comes from the Gospel of Luke in the 16th chapter, verses 19 to 31. I'll read it. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." There it is, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Mm-hmm. And you opened your sermon on Sunday by by sharing some of a conversation you had with a friend who was open and honest enough with you to share that this friend was struggling with faith.
Yeah, they were saying that as they looked out at the world and the events of everything going on, they were struggling with faith. How would God allow this, and what's going on? Where's God at? Those kinds of questions. And I can't say that I've always been this way, but my response to my friend in that conversation was, I get where they're coming from because I've thought that way before too, but now I've kind of switched, in that as I look at the events of our world today, I'm really convinced that it's an affirmation of what I've been trying to say is what's deeply true. And what's deeply true is, number one, God loves us, and then number two, as a result of that love, there's a certain way our lives are meant to work, and we either go with it or we go against it. And if we go with it, we flourish. We go against it, we perish. And what's the law? What's the absolute here? And the absolute, of course, is love.
Yeah.
We can't get away with living against the law of love any more than we can stop breathing and live. And everything that's happening right now is confirmation of that. We're trying to, right? We're trying to fail to love our neighbors. We're trying to willfully neglect that. And the more we do that, the worse it's getting. and people are like, well, that's not very hopeful. Yeah, it is. To me, it's quite hopeful that we are held by an absolute. That regardless of what I think, feel, believe, that this is here and this is consistent and I can rely on this. Doesn't mean that there's not consequences. There's obviously consequences. I hope we change course, absolutely. But the fact that this is happening tells me our world is what's the word here? Held together by some consistent way of life.
Yeah. I don't know if this is part of your conversation, but this is what came to mind as you were talking. When we say we're struggling with faith, sometimes what we mean is we're struggling with certainty. And one of the things that I've really come to appreciate in the last few weeks and months in our discussions and in your sermons is that faith isn't certainty. Mm-mm. Faith is a better synonym is trust. And when people struggle, sometimes I think they struggle because of doubts. But doubts are not separate from faith, right? Mm-hmm. So,
well, the classic definition is it's faith seeking understanding, mm-hmm. which hits at what you're talking about. It's faith as trust. In this case, if I was going to kind of build on what I just said, I believe that love is the way. But here's the thing. I have more to learn on how to love. I'm humble. Mm-hmm. I always have more to learn. And so I'm not always right. No one's always right. We all fall short, even on saying we're going to live by the law of love. We all fall short of that. Nevertheless, if we had that same common goal as a society and as a people where we're really serious about it, goodness gracious, things would be different. But we never quite get to that place where we're like, I have it all figured out. I mean, we basically, at that moment, a person who's done that, they've turned themselves into an idol. Their own egos become an idol. So not healthy at all. No.
Yeah. So you were all around this, but you were talking about the fact that it's all about loving our neighbor as ourselves and as God has loved us first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's about that simple.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As I've journeyed along, my faith has gotten much more simplified. I will say that. Seminary, it took me a while to kind of navigate all those weeds. But as I'm getting older now, it's just becoming much more simple. Yeah. And I guess I wouldn't say I'm certain, but I'm confident, which is different.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's true, because while faith isn't certainty yet, that living faith leads us closer mm-hmm. to certainty or an assurance.
Well, the word confidence, I've talked about this before. If you break it down, literally means to act with faith.
Yeah.
A confident person means they're acting with faith. I'm trusting I'm on the right path. I'm trusting that.
Okay, this is a sermon series on the stained glass windows here. And so, Pastor Andy, paint a word picture on the window that depicts the rich man and Lazarus.
Okay, so if we were in the sanctuary, you'd see at the very top of the window, as the parable suggested, there's a depiction of the rich, wealthy person sitting at a table eating sumptuously. The rich person's also wearing their designer clothes. The parable itself says he's wearing purple, but I don't think the window had it like that. I think he may have had like a green shirt on and maybe a purple like hat or something. But anyway, the rich person's eating and dressed in very, very expensive clothing. Underneath that rich man, as the parable talked about, is the poor man Lazarus. And Lazarus does not have is nude, basically, and then is begging for food. And that's certainly implied in the parable. But what's interesting, and I pointed out in my sermon, is how the rich man in the parable is not named, but the poor man is. And this is one of those moments in Jesus' parables where he's kind of flipping things. The world, of course, knows all the wealthy people. We put them on pedestals. We say that's what success looks like. We really hold them in high esteem. In a sense, I would even argue, in some ways, we worship them. We worship the successful and the wealthy, so to speak. But it's not like this in the parable. The rich man's not named in the parable, but the Lazarus, the poor beggar, is. And the name Lazarus actually means the one who God helps, or God helped. And that's what his name actually meant. So essentially what it's suggesting is that God is forever on the side of the poor, essentially. And so as you suggested, though, that's the way it was in this earth, when they were alive, and then they both died. And in the afterlife, the rich man goes to hell, and it's in the window, and then Lazarus goes to heaven. So in the window, you see Lazarus with Abraham, and he's kind of surrounded by the holy saints. And then the wealthy person now no longer has his fancy clothes at the bottom of the window. It's clear that he's in Hades. It's clear he's in a place of judgment, and he's now the one that's begging to be relieved of the torment. So,
I want to take off on a little bit of a side tangent right here, if you don't mind, because I think people listening might need a little bit of help with this. Not to open up this whole thing because we don't have time for that, but with the rich man going to Hades and he's tormented there, that's really not the idea that we get from the Old Testament about what Hades is. Hades is just really the place of the dead. I didn't understand it as a place of torment, but we have taken Hades and made it synonymous with hell, but it's not really.
There's different views on this. In the Hebrew Bible, as you suggested, when a person died, and even the idea of an afterlife is debated. To be fair, in the Old Testament, there's a debate whether or not the afterlife is actually affirmed in the Hebrew Bible. I would say there's some moments where it's implied, but it's not a pervasive theme. In any case, when it talked about people dying in the Old Testament, they went to a place called Sheol, the place of the dead. Everyone went there. It was like a holding place for the dead, and they awaited the final judgment. That's kind of the idea. And the word Hades actually comes more from Greek culture, not biblical. It's extra biblical. It comes out, if you look at, there's no Hades mentioned much in Scripture. That's a Greek concept. Okay. Yeah. So you'd have to get into kind of the Greek mythology. We don't need to go down that path. But yeah. And there's this chasm between them, right? So you don't get to just do whatever. You kind of get you reap what you sow in this next place of judgment is what's implied. Again, I will suggest, like I did the previous parable, though, notice the criteria of judgment. It's not your creed. It's not where you attended worship. It's not, did you get your theology right? It's a basic idea of, did you help those in need? Did you respond to human need? That's the point of the parable. And so, yeah, it's a warning about not only the afterlife, but also, I would argue, these parables are meant to be a warning about this life too, that because we live in a moral universe, what these parables are also trying to do is teach us, hey, we can't live like this and get away with it. It leads to our destruction. When these chasms develop between us, our world becomes unstable.
Very good. I think that's helpful, so I appreciate you letting me go off on that bit of a tangent.
No, I mean, we could go down. I was trying to be succinct, but
right.
Yeah.
No, that's good. Okay, so you started talking about faith. We've been talking about faith. And how is it that we lose faith? What causes it? And you quoted an archbishop by the name of Richard Trent.
Yeah, in my studies on this parable, one of the questions I had is, what leads to this lack of love between people? Like, what's the ultimate problem? What's the deep problem? And I came across this archbishop. He's Irish, wrote this quote from about 100 years ago, and he writes, the sin of Dives. So stop right there. The word Dives is actually the tradition of the church just had to name the rich man in the parable. They just couldn't deal with the fact that he didn't get named, so they the word Dives kind of is a play on the Greek in the parable, as I understand it. Anyway, so the sin of Dives, in its root, he writes, is unbelief. It's a lack of faith. Hard-hearted contempt of the poor, he writes, luxurious squandering on self are only forms which this deeper sin assumes. The seat of the disease is from within. And then Trench writes, he who believes not in an invisible world of righteousness and truth and spiritual joy must place his hope in things which he sees and can handle, taste, and smell. It is not the essence of the matter whether he hoards like the rich fool or squanders like the prodigal. In each case, he puts his trust in this world and the things that he can see because he doesn't believe in the invisible, that which he cannot see. And now if you're like me, you read a quote like that and you're thinking still, what's faith got to do with this? And it all depends on how you define faith. And what I mean by faith is like a person with faith believes there is an absolute. to talk about it in terms of the flip side, when we use the word sin, what is the essence of sin? Sin, as I would define it, is I'm trying to live my life as if God were somewhere else and thinking I can somehow get away with it, which if you stop and think about that, that's not very wise. The creator of the universe that made everything possible, I'm going to pretend like that creator does not exist. And now I'm going to go do my own thing and pretend I can get away with it. Not a great life choice. I'm just going to throw that out. So the opposite of that basic sin, though, then becomes faith. And what faith says, regardless of how I think or feel, what my opinion is about this, that, or the other, I still trust that there is an absolute. And so when society loses a sense in that, when we as a group lose a sense in that, what we basically begin to do is we become the narrators of our own story. We have these competing storylines that leads to these chasms between us. We go to war at one another, and oftentimes in the midst of that kind of conflict, what happens is the poor get neglected. If I'm the author of my story and there's really nothing that connects me with my neighbor, why do I care about my neighbor at that point? And so the root sin of all of this is a lack of trust or belief in the transcendent. And so I know that's all very theological and philosophical, but I would argue at the heart of the breakdown of our society today is this loss of this notion of the transcendent. I mean, and this idea that we struggle with this idea of having an absolute. I wrestle with even talking about it, which tells me within myself I'm struggling with that culture, because I'm wondering, I don't want to be labeled as one of those fundamentalist type Christians, right? I don't want to be labeled that way. But I also want to tell the truth as I understand it, and the truth as I understand it suggests there are some things really that we can do and not do, and we really don't get away with it in the end. We have to commit to a certain path if we're going to flourish. Anyway.
Well, you develop that by describing two ways that one can come to faith, and not that there are two that work. One works better than the other. Idealism and realism.
Yeah. And so going back to this competing narrative idea that I was talking about just moments ago, what faith as idealism kind of does, though, is like it's this subtle way of like, I'm going to come up with my own ideal now. And a lot of times what happens, I'm going to slap on some God language with it, and then I'm going to go out and impose it upon other people. This sort of faith as idealism, the big issue with it is it lacks love. That's what it lacks. I mean, yeah, in a nutshell. Well, I mean, I think about the words of Paul. There's a line in Paul that I've been thinking a lot about lately. In 1 Corinthians 13, if you've ever been to a Christian wedding, you've heard it read. Love is patient, love is kind. If you go on and read it, though, one of the lines in there that I've never heard much said on, but or talked about, it's really a good one, though. Love does not insist on its own way. Let's just stop right there for a moment. Translation: love is not going to dominate another because it's love. What faith as idealism ends up doing is it lacks love because it assumes I'm going to go dominate another. We'll force them into my box. And again, it implodes. Why? It goes back to this idea, what is the absolute? The absolute is love. And so when you lack that, no matter what your theology is, you might have it all figured out, so to speak. You might be close to the truth, so to speak. But if you lack love, that lack ends up just destroying itself in the end. So faith is realism. Once faith is realism, it's much more, I would call it experiential based. I step back, I look at my life, I look at the world. I've gone to the school of hard knocks, and I've come to realize through experiences that life really does work best in a Christ-like way. Regardless, even if a person is Christian or not, I would argue this. It transcends religion. Life works best in a Christ-like way. And there's that famous quote from Gandhi that kind of speaks to this. He goes, I like your Jesus.
Yeah.
It's your Christians. It's the Christians I'm not sure about. And Gandhi's acknowledging, hey, yeah, I mean, there's absolute truth in this guy. Like, what he's doing is real. And I'm on board. It's the implementation and the institution that you built around it that has its problems. I can't disagree with Gandhi on this one.
I can't either. While we're on quotations, you said that you learned this from your father, and you mentioned early on in our conversation today that this is the 1-year anniversary of your father's death. And you quoted him. You've quoted him before, and two fresh quotes in the sermons anyway from your father.
Yeah. So he taught me this idea of faith as realism, this experiential kind of thing where you can sit back and really just gauge for yourself through your own experience what's real or not. And so anyway, Dad had 2 quotes. One was, and this one I didn't like it. It always frustrated me. He said, "When your time's up, your time's up." Mm-hmm. It's kind of this fatalism. And I think what he meant was God has the capacity to get us home despite our shortcomings. Mm-hmm. Back to this idea, okay, I believe in this absolute God is love. I believe in that. We all fall short of that. And the good news of the gospel says, even when you fall short, God's love is so great, God can bring good out of it and get you home. That's the spirit, I think, of what he was getting at. And the second quote is kind of like the first quote to me. The second quote, my dad would always say this. Well, he would go, the truth always has a way of coming out. Just sit back and watch. It'll happen. It'll come out. It reminds me of, there's a story in Acts where a Jewish leader is asked about the Christians, and he says, well, if it's of God, it'll last, essentially what happens there. And that's kind of the approach my dad would take often, especially when we disagreed. We're both committed Christians. We're both pastors. We don't always agree on what it looks like to live the faithful life, sure. But he had the good sense to say, well, let's be humble about this. In the end, the truth has a way of coming out. There's a lot of wisdom in that approach. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Good. Okay, you finished up by offering 3 practices to grow in this experience of Christ-like love.
Yeah, well, let me just use one of them.
Okay.
Because I know, we're getting a little bit short on time, so let me
pick out the best one.
I cherry pick. I was messing with. I was kind of playing around with what we call the transcendentals, mm-hmm. And it's just kind of like, it's like this Hades conversation. We don't have time to go through it all, but what the transcendentals say is like God, the ground of our being. There's some things that are deeply true about the ground of our being and therefore the world around us. And so there's some certain things that we can implement and see in our lives that help us to grow in our faith. And the transcendentals are beauty, truth, and goodness. Those are the 3. I will just focus on the first of those because I think that's a great one to start with. Beauty helps us to grow in our faith. Why? Well, the fact that it's beautiful suggests that an artist made it, so to speak. And much like a book takes on the mind of its author, this world, as we see the beauty of this world, is a reflection of the heart of God. That's a great way to transcend our differences, because no matter where you're at on the spectrum, so to speak, theologically, politically, whatever, we all stand in awe of a sunset on the ocean, right? Or we all stand in awe looking at the mountain. And we realize we transcend it, transcendental, by experiencing that beauty. That's a great way to grow in our faith. And just kind of a day-to-day practical way to lean into the beauty is just to practice gratitude, right? Mm-hmm. To just stop and think about like the good things that have happened, the things to be thankful for. It's kind of like the difference between luck and blessed and what it means to be blessed. Lucky says, hey, it went my way. I'm lucky. Blessed says, I have someone to thank. And so what gratitude really does in terms of the spiritual journey is like, I take the time to be grateful for just the beauty in the world as I see it. And it's a reminder of the fact that God made it. It comes from a greater source. And then that source is with me too. So I just throw that out as a simple practice. Now, I know I've kind of went outside of what the parable was talking about at this point, but if at the end of the day we're trying to grow in our faith, just the experience of beauty is a great way to go.
There we go. Amen. All right, so I'll be in the pulpit this Sunday, and so I'll be able to tackle one of these parables on the stained glass windows here. And this Sunday we'll be in the 20th chapter of Matthew. This one is the laborers in the vineyard. This one's a good one because it is convicting as heck for all of us, because it just really defines, in a wonderful way, how we are. But the story, I'm not going to read it. I'll just paraphrase it here. Jesus starts out by saying, for the kingdom of heaven, he starts a lot of his parables that way. What's the kingdom of heaven like? Well, it's like this. It's like a landowner who went out and hired workers for his vineyard, and he went out early, then he went back out at 9, he went back out at noon, he went back out at 3, he went back out at 5. And at the end of the day, he paid them, and that was the custom. They would hiring a day worker was a typical thing to do in that culture, and so there would be a marketplace of workers, and they would go out and they would get them. So he went all these times, and some of them worked 9 hours, and some of them worked 1 hour. And the long story short is he paid them all the same denarius. So when the 1 hour workers, when the 9 hour workers saw that the 1 hour workers got paid the same denarius that the 9 hour workers had been promised, they thought, oh boy, this must mean that we're going to get paid a lot more. But they did not. So, we've been talking about democracy in this presidential election. We've been talking about the fact that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy on the one side, and on the other side, if we're just going to anoint a candidate to replace President Biden, that's a slap in the face to democracy. But I'm not going to talk about democracy. I'm going to talk about another ocracy, and it's meritocracy, and that's what this is, because we do in our culture, we operate on a meritocracy. We want to merit what we get, and we want others to merit what they get. And this is why these 9 hour workers are so upset. They're so upset that they didn't think that the 1 hour workers merited it. And if they merited 1 denarius for 1 hour, then wouldn't we merit a whole lot more for 9 hours? And of course, what they're missing is the grace of God to be as gracious as God wants to be. That is hard to wrap our heads around. That's why I love this parable so much, because if we're honest with ourselves, we would be upset too if we did 9 hours of work and the 1 hour workers got paid the same wage. So we'll delve into that parable coming up this weekend here at Methodist Temple. Join us if you can. If you don't have a church home, we worship at 8:30. That's our traditional service. At 11 o'clock is our contemporary service. And in between, both Andy and I have Sunday school classes. And so you're invited to all that. And of course, maybe you have your own church, or maybe you're distant, and maybe electronically is the way that you worship with us, and you can do that as well. But whatever is the case, we're happy that you're with us today. We really do appreciate it. We pray that you have a great week, and that we'll see you again next week.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.